Recording.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Monday noon. And we are here all together for this wonderful session, Trauma Informed Nutrition Therapy, What Dietitian Needs to Know. And my honor is to introduce today's speaker, Mr. David Wiss. So, a little bit about Mr. David Wiss. David Wiss MS RDN is the founder of Nutrition Recovery, which is a good practice in Los Angeles, specializing in substance abuse disorders, eating disorders, body image, mental health, as well as general wellness. Mr. Wiss has contributed scientific literature, peer-reviewed journal on his various topic of expertise. Currently, he's working on his PhD in public health from the University of California, Los Angeles. So with that, welcome, Mr. Wiss, and floor is yours now.
Wow, thank you so much. I want to really thank Sangeeta and Gigi and the entire team that makes this possible. I'm really excited to present on this topic. I'm very passionate about nutrition. I'm passionate about mental health. I'm passionate about recovery. So I do get excited. Bear with me. I know that I speak fast, and I'll definitely leave some time for some chat and discussion at the end. I do make my slides pretty dense with the hope that you can look over the PDF. There's a lot of references here, a lot of resources. My goal today is to get dietitians excited about the possibility of being involved in mental health care. So in addition to being a academic, I'm also a private practice dietitian here in West Los Angeles, and active on social media, Instagram, TikTok, and happy to make some new friends today. So I have no financial conflicts of interest. However, I will say that I'm very biased towards nutrition for mental health. I think it is the future. I think that there's a lot of room for us as dietitians to grow into this space. And hopefully the talk today can give you some encouragement to consider the possibilities of working on an integrated team of mental health professionals and others providing care for trauma, PTSD, early life adversity. We're going to talk about substance disorders, that's drug addiction, eating disorders. We're going to talk about food addiction a little bit as well today. I want to state that I have no particular way of eating, so I have no dietary preferences that bias my way of thinking about food, and I have no hidden agendas. I'm not here to convince anyone to do anything other than what they're already doing. My main goal is to encourage open-mindedness and forward thinking. The work that we're going to talk about today is grounded in the biopsychosocial model of health, which is a common and popular theory in the health psychology space. It came from the world of medicine in an effort to integrate biological sciences with psychology and socio-cultural factors, and to start thinking about things as a system. One of the major criticisms of the biomedical model is the reductionistic way of thinking about things. And what we're going to do today is encourage thinking at a systems level and to be thinking about context. Okay, so everything we talk about today is going to be put into the larger context. And, this topic of trauma and early life adversity is certainly something that needs to be considered in the context of vulnerability, right? What makes someone more vulnerable? What might make someone resilient? However, I will say that we will be focusing a lot on the biology today, given that, the biological embedding of adversity is certainly, a hot and new area of scientific inquiry. So in the domain of psychosomatic medicine, you can see here, and this is one of these dense slides, and there'll be more of these. This is an image from a very worthwhile reading, and you can see the citation in the bottom right: Psychosomatic Medicine, the Scientific Foundation of the Biopsychosocial Model. You can see that there's these different domains, right? And there's a lot of overlap. And in the middle, right, is the overlap of the biopsychosocial domains. And one of the key disorders that we're going to focus on today are addictive disorders, which is an example of a biopsychosocial approach. Meanwhile, there have been people that challenge the purely biological way of thinking about addiction as a quote unquote brain disease, right? There's definitely discussion about considering some of the other underlying psychosocial and psychological issues like anxiety and depression or social isolation, considering neighborhood characteristics. And in public health, we always think about socioeconomic status, systemic and structural factors, looking at the fundamental causes, the causes of the causes, right? We want to go upstream and to think about how social factors can get underneath the skin. You know, I stand on the shoulder of giants. I'm really fortunate to be at UCLA, where there's been a lot of groundbreaking work. This is an example of a biopsychosocial approach. You could see from this review article, the authors considered how chronic stress and allostatic load, which we'll talk about a little bit today, that's the biology, mental distress, that's the psychology, and then coping resources, that could be social factors. And all these things together can quote unquote get under the skin and create health disorders. So in public health, we always want to contextualize risk. So if we were to think about something like genetic vulnerability, we would put it in social context, consider the family, consider the social environment, and think about how all of these things together can alter someone's biological systems and, for example, increase someone's risk for certain health behaviors, right? For example, drug use, eating behaviors, risky sexual abuse, etc. And then finally, how all of this collectively can lead to both mental and physical health problems over the life course. So this is a little roadmap of where we're headed, at least from the biological standpoint. We are going to talk about non-biological factors like dietary restraint and stigma in the context of weight and eating disorders. So we're going to bring it all together today. So this is an exciting, it's an exciting day. I think it's time to have this discussion, and thank you all for being here. Thank you all for who just joined. I'm certainly excited to answer some questions at the end. So in terms of the early psychosocial environment, you know, there's a lot of potential for adversity, stressors, and other forms of trauma and deprivation, whether it be in utero, in the first 1,000 days, which we talk often about as either a critical or a sensitive period. And even adversity in the adolescent years, right, can become biologically embedded and affect people in ways that science is only beginning to elucidate. One example is epigenetic changes by way of DNA methylation and some other pathways. This is how genes can be turned on or turned off based on certain social and environmental exposures. Another example would be the immune system. We're going to talk about inflammation a little bit today. We're definitely going to focus on alterations in brain health, specifically the reward pathways. The mesolimbic dopaminergic projection is altered by trauma and can certainly predispose people to addiction-like behaviors across multiple domains. And we'll touch on the HPA axis briefly, which is the stress response most people associate with cortisol. So there's this question, why is it that two people could be exposed to the same adversity and one person will have their life course trajectory completely altered and the other person will become resilient to the exposure? So the evidence that we have suggests that it's a combination of an individual's genotype mixed with the exposures and some of the other sometimes difficult to measure social, socio, and cultural factors that create a phenotype, right? And these differential susceptibilities can lead to changes in reward processing. That's the dopamine system. Threat processing. That's the mostly the amygdala, which we'll talk about, and memory processing, which we'll touch on as part of the hippocampus. We are going to talk about some sensitive things today, and I just want to be really clear. There's sensitive language coming. I will be talking about obesity, and I do want to state that it's important to discern between talking about obesity at an individual level, talking about people, and also talking about obesity at the population level, talking about groups. I have done several papers on food addiction. I know that it's controversial. I know that it's often not well received. and I do plan to clear up some of the misconceptions shortly. And I will be talking about sexual abuse, okay? And I'm using that as an example. It's definitely one area where I've done a lot of work. This diagram is in a paper that we have currently under review. It really maps out how, for example, child sexual abuse can become biologically embedded, which we'll talk about, and lead to a wide range of different behavioral health disorders, substance use disorder, food addiction, eating disorders, and these often cluster and co-occur and create risk for these other disorders. And where this becomes relevant for dietitians, for example, is that all of these quote unquote disorders have implications for weight status over the lifespan. In many cases, they're associated with weight suppression, whether it be through restriction or through drug use. And in other cases, it's associated with weight gain and the experience of living in a larger body. Now, the paper that we have submitted and under review was designed to challenge this idea that became very popular in the 80s and 90s that individuals exposed to childhood sexual abuse would gain weight deliberately or purposely to prevent further victimization. Now, I'm not going to say that that's untrue, but what I will say is that we have all this new data to show that trauma can actually affect physiology in ways that affect behavior, that affect things like eating behavior, drug taking behavior, and there are chains of risk, okay? So it's not always just some psychological construct. There are chains of risk that have been measured in biological domains. So in terms of food addiction, I do think that it has a very bad rep because it's associated with individuals. And I think when people hear food addiction, they assume that it means someone needs to become really rigid and go on some diet and start cutting things out and become really, really difficult to count, and that it's a very exclusive way of eating. It promotes diet culture, shaming. It's all about weight loss and restriction, and it's very stigma. I think a lot of people associated with 12-step can be very rigid, and it's a lot of focus on the food. Whereas in the classic eating disorder space, where I do a lot of work, it's a different message. We talk about it being not about the food, promoting body positivity, including food, being against diet culture, shame reduction, health at every size, inclusion, moderation, etc. But I do want to state that while these assumptions seem to persist, they are misconceptions and they're not necessarily true. Okay, although I will say in many cases they are true. A lot of people from this camp are like this, but as researchers, and I'm coming to you as a researcher as well as a clinician, I'm saying we need to look beyond some of this dichotomania and start to think about this purely from a more biological standpoint. We do have evidence that understanding a food addiction explanation actually decreases weight stigma, okay? There is some ideas that addiction is stigmatizing, and that if people are addicted, then they are in a stigmatized group. And it's been shown that the opposite is true, that once we understand the neurobiology of trauma and of addiction-like behaviors, it actually decreases the stigma. And this has been shown in other research as well. Once people understand the neurobiology, we start to move this message of, oh, it's just about personal responsibility out. So it's not just, oh, you need to try harder. You need to just eat differently or maybe exercise, right? We're starting to understand that stressors and multiple forms of adversity can become biologically embedded and make it very difficult for people to change certain behaviors, okay? So this is really, really important. Food addiction, if we think about it on a public health, population health perspective, can actually be a good target for reducing weight stigma and getting people to understand why people struggle, so we don't give them such basic messages, right? Here's your handout. You need to try harder. You're not doing it because you're not ready. Call me when you're ready. That kind of real basic assumptions that a lot of people in the fitness world, including probably some dietitians, make. So the point of trauma-informed nutrition therapy is to develop a new set of assumptions, to understand what's going on, So we're not pushing the message of personal responsibility on people, and instead we're coming from a place of understanding and compassion. I highly recommend this paper. It was published a few months ago in the Nutrients Journal, and we put together a diagram, which is a really good roadmap for where some of this talk is headed today. You could see that the top box in the middle, stress, trauma, and adversity, those things are lumped together. So I want to be really clear. Stress is not the same thing as PTSD, right? And adversity is not the same thing as child sexual abuse, right? These are very broad terms. So I lump them together here just for simplicity, but I do want to really express that there's a lot of nuance there. There's a lot of room for these things to be different. And in public health, when we think about psychosocial stress, we always think about the upstream drivers, the socioeconomic status as being a fundamental cause. So in a model of obesity, we can think about socioeconomic status being a driver of perhaps family level or neighborhood level or school level stress, trauma, and adversity. It's also a driver of a food environment. There's been a lot of evidence to show that lower social class neighborhoods have more quote unquote toxic food environments, all of which together can lead to a more addictive like relationship to food. So that doesn't mean, oh, these people are food addicts. It means that the susceptibility to stressors can change people's reward systems, and then the exposure to the highly palatable food can actually be a risk factor for weight gain over time. Now, to make matters worse, we have weight stigma in our society, and people are still operating under the assumption that you should be able to weigh whatever you want. So I just need to change what I do and I should be able to choose my weight. By the way, I just want to be really clear that is not true. Weight is not always a choice. Most of the time it's not, okay? So we have all this data now to show that stigma can actually be a form of stress, trauma, and adversity. Stigma can also drive dieting behavior, and dieting behavior can also make addiction like eating way worse, okay? So conceptually, we're going to talk about the biology, but we're also going to talk about the psychology and the public health implications. A couple of things about food addiction. It became popular in 2007, 2008. There was a tool that was validated using the DSM-4 criteria for substance dependence, and it's since been updated. There's a Yale Food Addiction Scale 2.0. There's a version for children. It's been translated to dozens of different languages and used worldwide. There's a modified version. The tool has been used in hundreds and hundreds of studies, validated, revalidated, and has quite a bit of scientific merit. But one of the major shortcomings is that the tool does not adjust for dietary restraint. So if someone is trying to lose weight, it's very likely that their food addiction symptoms can be a relic of dieting rather than actual food addiction. Now, with respect to PTSD, I have a personal theory that a lot of people have trauma from the experience in living in a body that doesn't feel like home, whether it be from their adolescent period or some form of abuse or being teased or bullied. And a lot of people spend a good portion of their lives trying to avoid the experience of living in a body that didn't feel like home. And that could play out with a lot of dieting behavior. And then the dieting behavior can create addiction like eating. So we need to think about all the different possibilities. This just shows how food addiction has grown since 2010. And I've been very fortunate to contribute to this literature. But again, my contributions are from an eating disorder informed lens. I'm thinking about food addiction from a stigma, from a dietary restraint perspective, and I'll be talking about some of that today. One of the main features of our talk today is to talk about early life adversity. The most established tool is called the ACE measure. Hopefully by now you've heard of the ACE questionnaire. It was really 10 questions introduced in the late 90s in San Diego in a Kaiser system. They had a large data set and found people exposed to multiple ACEs, 4 or more, had about 7 times increased risk of being alcoholic, using illicit drugs about 5, and injecting drugs about 10-fold. So this data was a pretty big splash. Of course, the the sample was not representative, and they've done ACE research on nationally representative samples and have shown, quite similar estimates. This is from the CDC. Really points out how, trauma can become embodied, and how adverse childhood experiences can disrupt neurodevelopment, essentially affect people's risk-taking behavior over time, and can lead to early mortality as well as morbidity. I'm going to read some of the ACE questions that have been introduced in the state of California. Things like living with a parent caregiver who went to prison, feeling unsupported, unloved. These are different forms of emotional neglect, household dysfunction, living with someone who had a mental health issue, parent caregiver insulted, humiliated, biological parent had a problem with alcohol or drugs, being neglected in terms of care from a caregiver, seeing a parent get insulted or attacked, physical abuse, sexual abuse, significant changes in the parental relationships. And then we also have ACEs that have been expanded. So the original ACEs were about the household. And now we've learned that in a lot of communities, people can have a decent household upbringing, but experience trauma in their neighborhoods, right? Maybe through racism, bullying, othering, other forms of denigration. So school violence, other issues that might have happened in the neighborhood, immigration status, etc., right? Detained, arrested, incarcerated. So these are expanded ACEs. They've actually added quite a few more to be able to catch a wider range of adversity. I do want to state that not everyone who's exposed to multiple ACEs develops trauma or PTSD, right? So like I said before, some people are quite resilient to these exposures, and other people have consequences that can play out in multiple forms over their life. It is important to acknowledge that there are some pushback about screening for ACEs, and one of the real arguments against it is that we don't have a clear intervention available, right? So let's say we find out someone has 6 ACEs in primary care. What are we going to do, right? It's not crystal clear. And in public health, we say don't screen if you can't treat, right? So there's definitely some debate here. Me as a researcher, I find this information quite valuable because I do work with eating disorders. I actually screen for ACEs in my private practice. I want to know what people have been exposed to. As a dietitian, I don't necessarily ask more details or want to know any specifics, but it is very helpful information for me to know if some of the disordered eating might be biologically embedded, okay? So a lot of this work was, in terms of PTSD and food addiction, was pioneered by one of my mentors, Dr. Brewerton, and there's the two of us several years ago at a conference. He put out a book in 2013 about eating disorders, addictions, and substance use disorders. And it was an effort to merge this information, these differing schools of thought. Let's bring it together. Let's create integrated care. Let's start to think about these things from a comprehensive standpoint instead of this is the silo over here, the silo over here. How do we do treatment in an integrated care model rather than sequentially, right? Meaning go from one treatment center to the next. And those of us that work in mental and behavioral health have seen a lot of people bouncing around from different types of treatment, right? And the real argument that I'm going to make today, and that a lot of mental health professionals see, is that oftentimes there's trauma that doesn't get addressed, it doesn't get treated, and because of that, people don't have success with any treatment, or they'll have success in the short term, and other issues will then start to arise. So we put out a paper in 2017 called the DFANG, and this was about integrating food addiction into the disordered eating field with an effort to, clear up some of the confusion around it and help people think about achieving sustainable recovery. So this is a clinical model. This was designed for treatment settings for individuals and for treatment teams. One of the main points of the paper was just to suggest that consideration of someone's substance use disorder history can be very important in understanding their eating behavior. So substance use is obviously alcohol and drugs, but we also want to think about caffeine, nicotine, behavioral addictions. You can learn a lot about someone if you study their compulsive behaviors, impulsive states and traits, etc. We recently published a systematic review and meta-analysis linking ACEs to obesity over the lifespan. And in our paper, we found that there was a 46% increase in the odds of adult obesity following exposure to multiple ACEs. So once we pooled all the data, it's been shown that individuals who have been exposed to 2, 3, 4, or more ACEs have approximately a 46% increased risk of obesity over time. And in the paper, we started to discuss some of the possible biological mechanisms. And we looked at what the authors said, and it came to be that most authors were not aware, I shouldn't say not aware, did not mention in their discussion the possibility for neurological changes to be responsible for this outcome. We recently published another paper called Separating the Signal from the Noise, How Psychiatric Diagnoses Can Help Discern Food Addiction from Dietary Restraint. And this was an extension on the DFANG paper. And what we've done here is, instead of just thinking about substance use disorder, reward dysfunction, and other behavioral addictions, it's really important to think about trauma, PTSD, and early life adversity in the context of eating behavior. So I'll come back to that paper, I think, toward the end. I want to give you some of the data that's shown up, and bear with me. I'm really excited to share some of this information and looking forward to questions toward the end. This is nationally representative data from the NESARC. And nationally representative data sets usually have 10, 20, 30,000 people that have a diverse population, so the findings can be extrapolated, okay? And it was shown in this particular study that child maltreatment increased the odds of all the eating disorders, okay? So anorexia, binge eating disorder, and bulimia nervosa, all of them are increased following childhood adversity. I'm going to look at sexual abuse because that's our example for today. You can see here that the odds for anorexia is about 2-fold, whereas the odds of binge eating disorder is about 3-fold. So I want to be really clear, if you were to compare the anorexia column to the binge eating column, you would see that the estimates for binge eating disorder are always higher than anorexia nervosa. So there's something about the binge that is relevant to childhood maltreatment and trauma. This is a meta-analysis. Again, we're sticking with sexual abuse, okay? So these are the pooled studies linking sexual abuse to the eating disorders. And you can see that once they're pooled, the estimates for bulimia nervosa is actually higher than binge eating disorder, okay? So sexual abuse increases the risk for anorexia a little bit, increases for binge eating disorder for sure, but the highest risk is for bulimia nervosa, which starts to kind of pose some other interesting questions. What is it about some of these conditions, and how are they different? So this next paper was a longitudinal study, which has more power than a cross-sectional study, better causal inference, I should say. And one of the things they did here was separated anorexia nervosa into the restrictive type, into the binge purge type. So you could see here, when you separate the anorexia into the two groups, child sexual abuse is not associated with the restrictive type, but it is associated with the binge purge type. So there's something about the binge that is important for trauma survivors, okay? And it's likely related to the reward system. But when we look at other systematic review and meta-analysis, we do see that all forms of child maltreatment are associated with all forms of eating disorders. So if you look at these odds ratios, whether it be child maltreatment overall, sexual maltreatment, physical, emotional, the estimates are pretty similar, 2 to 3-fold, right? It tells a pretty consistent story that there's something about trauma that affects people's relationships to food. We also know, as I mentioned from our systematic review and meta-analysis, that all forms of abuse also increase risk for obesity. And you can see here that the estimates are a little bit lower. You know, our paper said 46%. This is 28, 36, 31. So the increase in risk of obesity is not as strong as the risk for eating disorders. So we start to think about, well, what are the mechanisms at play? How does other forms of addiction, drug addiction, how did this all start to play in, right? When you think about weight status over the life course, how does exposures to multiple forms of abuse change physiology, increase risk for these three different conditions, and how does it oscillate and change over time? And, you know, where I do a lot of work with nutrition and recovery is people that end up in treatment, they end up in recovery, and then a lot of these issues might start to show up. Perhaps there's some medications, maybe they've had an eating disorder and then engaging in bulimic symptomatology for many years. And once in recovery, things start to happen, right? People start to gain weight. And, you know, in many cases, you know, there's ways to neutralize people's relationships to their body, start to move people toward body neutrality, body positivity. But in other cases, this is a major risk factor for relapse into either eating disorder behaviors or other behaviors. So in other longitudinal data, it has been shown that the earlier the event, the earlier the trauma, the more likely the outcome is weight gain over time. Okay, so this really implies how adversity can become biologically embedded. Okay, so people that have victimhood in the recent past often lose weight, but over time they tend to gain weight. We also know that abused children don't gain weight rapidly. It happens slowly over time. So this is what we mean when we say life course research, okay? It provides more support for this concept of biological embedding over time. So let's look at a little bit more science. Let's bring food addiction into the picture. This is from a large Brazilian sample. It was shown that both psychological and sexual abuse do increase risk for food addiction over time. And this makes a lot of sense, okay? If the ACE study showed that people exposed to ACEs have, you know, 4 to 5 times increased risk for drug addiction, it makes sense given the neurobiological overlap between drug addiction and food addiction that people exposed to trauma, sexual abuse are going to have addictions in other areas, okay? And, you know, I do a lot of work with people in recovery. Sometimes they report addiction like eating was the predisposing factor. It was around when they were young. And other people say it wasn't around until after they got sober. So maybe there was trauma, maybe their reward system was altered, maybe the drug seeking and the alcohol continued to alter their neurobiology. And then at the end of it all, now they're sober, they're left with a dysfunctional relationship to food. So is that easy to change? No. Do people need to go on rigid diets to fix that? No. But does understanding it help people? Yes. When you're able to truly understand what someone's been through, why they might be eating in a certain way, the role of you know, societal weight stigma, the dietary restraint that might be contributing to the dysfunction, people can get a better conceptual framework of their eating behavior and start to get better, okay? The Nurses' Health Study, large sample size, again showed both severe physical and sexual abuse, increased risk for food addiction by about 90%. The estimates are pretty similar. So I think one of the main points that I want to make is that it almost doesn't matter what kind of trauma it is. If it's sexual abuse or physical abuse, it becomes biologically embedded and affects people's physiology and can play out in their relationship to food. This paper from JAMA, again, very large data set from the Nurses' Health Study, showed that symptoms of PTSD were more strongly related to food addiction when the symptoms occurred at an earlier age, and that the PTSD food addiction association did not differ substantially by trauma type. So key point is that all forms of trauma increase risk for all forms of addiction. And, you know, with respect to eating disorders, I posit right? I believe this to be true, but hasn't necessarily been described, that a lot of people develop eating disorders because they've developed addiction-like eating. And this isn't well accepted in the eating disorder communities or circles. A lot of people that have trauma develop reward dysfunction, have addiction-like eating, and then develop an eating disorder to manage that, okay? And this is obviously new information, and I'd love to hear from some of you that work in the field. We have ACE data on bariatric surgery seeking patients. Again, no surprise here, you know, elevated ACE score increased the likelihood of screening positive for food addiction and more severe food addiction. So let's talk about some mechanisms. Yes, let's go there. We're dietitians. We like the biology. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this conversation and presentation would be remiss without talking about some of these pathways. The first one that we're going to talk about is inflammation, allostatic load. And you can see here that, you know, these are interconnected, these different pathways. The interconnectedness of them is not crystal clear at this time, but this is where we're headed. I'm going to touch on each of these very, very briefly. Bruce McEwen was a very well-known stress hormone researcher who actually died about a year ago. Rest in peace, somewhat mysteriously. He did some really important work showing how social context can create stressors that can be registered as threats, which essentially create a biological response and lend itself to a lot of different kind of mediating pathways, the release of a lot of different molecules, whether they be you know, inflammatory markers or other blood markers. We'll see here the original allostatic load study looked at blood pressure, cholesterol, HDL ratio, you know, hemoglobin, A1C, cortisol, some of the neurotransmitters, etc. And you know, this concept has gotten a lot of traction in the literature. Essentially, what they've done is dichotomized the biomarker at either high or low, and if someone is out of range, they get a point. So the more points someone has for having an out of range biomarker, the higher allostatic load they have. And this makes it very difficult for some people to be able to adapt to change. Okay, so there's been a lot of different ways people have operationalized this concept over the years. They've added new markers, things like fibrinogen, C-reactive protein, etc. This paper from 2011, Dr. Gregory Miller, has really paved the road for understanding the biological embedding of childhood adversity. And you can see here from the diagram that there's early life programming through multiple pathways, and that the immune system through macrophages and monocytes essentially releases, you know, cytokines and creates a pro-inflammatory state that actually can persist over the lifespan. It turns out that some of this pro-inflammatory conditions can cross the blood-brain barrier, increase people's impulsive behaviors and other high-risk you know, patterns. Okay, so a lot of complication. I'm actually going to walk you through a little bit more of a diagram in a few minutes to really break down the pathways. But in a nutshell, early life stress can lead to the production of cytokines, low-grade peripheral inflammation, can cross the blood-brain barrier. It can lead to neuroinflammation, and this can perpetuate the cycle of risky behaviors, okay? And it can affect the dopamine system. And I'll be honest, it's not fully understood, but the research on neuroinflammation is mounting rapidly, and it's such an important and hot topic. But it's supposed that, you know, the neuroinflammation process is part of why people experience withdrawal. There's a part of the brain called the amygdala, and it's been proposed that the amygdala can experience some of this kind of inflammatory processes, and that it's involved in the craving cascade. So this is my work. I want to share. It's probably hard to see, especially if you're on a phone, but this is the context of alcohol use disorder linking to anxiety, depression, and craving, and how early life adversity as a predisposing risk factor can affect not only alcohol consumption, but gut health, leading to dysbiosis as well as intestinal permeability. And so you could see early life adversity is the risk factor for a lot of these different spots along the trajectory. We know that chronic alcohol can lead to anxiety, depression, and craving. We know that when alcohol affects the gut, it can affect the production of what we're calling postbiotics, other bacterial metabolites, and that can affect mental health. We know that alcohol can lead to intestinal permeability, leaky gut, and the mucosal layer can become compromised. We know that leaky gut can lead to anxiety, depression, and craving, but we're going to map out here some of these different pathways that might explain why this is all true. So, as we mentioned, things can cross the gut barrier, things like LPS, lipopolysaccharide, activate the immune system. This LPS can bind to the toll-like receptor 4. This will increase cytokine production. The immune system further goes on, to receive threat at the level of the liver. We know that from the gut-derived immune activation, these monocytes and macrophages can create peripheral inflammation. So we've got a whole cascade of inflammatory markers kicking off. We've got low-grade systemic inflammation. And the hot topic, where things are starting to get really interesting, is how these things can cross the blood-brain barrier. So the tight junctions in the neurovascular endothelial cells can create what we call leaky brain. Okay, so there's an increase in the permeability at the brain, and this is at the level of the astrocytes and the microglia. There's really good research on the microglia. And so ethanol itself can also cross the blood-brain barrier and affect neuroinflammation. But when ethanol is in conjunction with early life adversity, and there's pro-inflammatory cascades, and there's other gut derived issues, then you've got a cascade effect, okay? You've got a collection of risk factors that lead to higher levels of anxiety, depression, craving, all of which can contribute to relapse, right? And that can create the cycle. Now, I would like to propose that while this has been pretty well described, some really good work coming out of the Belgian group, Sophie Leclerc has done a lot of this research, we can start to think about eating behavior from a somewhat similar way, okay? If you're not familiar with blood-brain barrier, it's worth it. Neuroinflammation through breakdown of the BBB, the NLRP3 inflammasome, tons of research happening here. This is just a diagram to show how the brain can become leaky. We know that poor diet's involved in all this. We know that the Western diet can lead to oxidative stress, increase someone's level of impulsivity, multiple forms of addiction, lead to craving, and thus the cycle continues. Now, this is very different from what we learn in classic eating disorder models where, we say, there's no bad foods and all foods fit, and all those things are very helpful messages. But when you start looking at the biological pathways in the context of things like PTSD and early life adversity, you have to make the argument that the food matters, okay? It does matter what people eat. Does being obsessed with the quality of the food people eat help them? Maybe not. But does using an anti-inflammatory dietary approach help them? If it's done with a sane mind and a well-integrated approach, I'm going to go ahead and say abso-freaking-lutely. Okay, so I'm not talking about the microbiome today, but I just want to mention it really briefly. It is part of this kind of big picture. We know that when there's a lot of inflammation, we decrease in the diversity of the bacteria, increase in ability of the gut, and it can lead to this sustained low-level inflammation, which is, where a lot of people are living their lives and aren't even necessarily aware of it. So the future is now, right? Gut-brain axis, super critical, very relevant to trauma. There is some studies that have started to show links between early life adversity and altered gut bacteria. Some work from UCLA, some very smart people have described the gut-brain interactions related to food addiction and how some of this intestinal permeability can actually drive ingestive behavior. Highly recommend this review article. Should be open access. So let's talk briefly about the HPA axis and the epigenetic processes. We know that DNA methylation, which is, only one of the epigenetic processes. DNA methylation is an enzymatically catalyzed modification of DNA. You can see here, there's other forms of epigenetic modification, but for the sake of simplicity, we're only going to talk about DNA methylation. There's different sites where this can be captured. It's been documented following exposure to early life trauma and adversity. The one that I've been most interested in is the NR3C1. That's the glucocorticoid receptor. This is responsible for the output of cortisol through the HPA axis. I should say that it's responsible for influencing the output. The cascade is very, very difficult. You can see the HPA axis here from the hypothalamus, the release of CRH, pituitary releasing ACTH, and finally the adrenals releasing glucocorticoids, which is cortisol in humans. It's complicated because they're feedback loops. So it's not just a step-by-step process. Each step can communicate back. And if you see here, prior to the hypothalamus, there's other parts of the brain that are influencing the hypothalamus. So the area where they've done research on the glucocorticoid receptor is at the level of the hippocampus. So it's possible that, the high levels of cortisol that start off high and end up low, by the way, can affect the way that the hippocampus is receiving this feedback loop, and can essentially leave people in a stress response, which is very unfavorable and can lead to threat vigilance and a very difficult time calming down when things get stressful. In terms of the HPA axis, you can see here, starting from the brain, this pathway again, with these different hormones, and finally the release of cortisol. Really important to remember that, we have this dopamine pathway starting in the ventral tegmental area, communicating to the ventral striatum and to the prefrontal cortex. And then there's also an oxytocin pathway, which I think is starting to receive a little bit more attention. People that have been exposed to early life adversity are also getting impacts in their oxytocin, especially in the case of caregiver and emotional neglect. So this paper I highly recommend. It's a few years old, but summarizes adverse childhood experiences across the dopamine pathways affecting receptor expression, dopamine production, reward sensitivity, risk-taking behavior. We're looking at the oxytocin pathways as well, and the HPA axis, and they're all interrelated. All of these things together increase susceptibility to addiction, and thus the cycle continues, okay? Reward sensitivity is mostly focused on the dopamine system. I can be honest, as a dietitian, understanding the neurobiology of drug addiction and understanding a little bit about neurochemistry has helped me tremendously in terms of helping understand human behavior and also motivating people for change. And I just want to really recommend to dietitians to dive into the neuroscience, understand the neuroscience of addiction, how different parts of the brain communicate to each other, connect to each other, and essentially govern a lot of our decision-making processes. In this paper, it's been shown that early life stress affects the way rewards are processed. So this is at the level of the ventral striatum. Reward responsiveness, so the way that people respond to rewards or potential rewards, is processed differently. So people that have been exposed to trauma and early life stress process rewards differently than people that have not been. And hopefully this message is starting to become clear. Early life stress could come in the form of childhood adversity. Like I said before, it can also come in the community or in the other environmental factors. It could come through ethnic minority status. all of it affects the way these different parts of the brain communicate with each other. And, one of the key points in addiction research is this idea of salience. Salience is the assignment of value. So it works with the memory to learn that something is rewarding. So if someone's been exposed to trauma and then they learn how to emotionally eat, the brain is going to register that as something that works. The memory is going to store the experience of the dopamine release from the food. And when someone has negative affect, it's going to suggest that they do it again. Okay. And this is how we learn things. The dopamine system is not just about reward. The dopamine system is about the learning of reward. So it teaches the brain what works. And so a lot of these maladaptive behaviors are essentially can be viewed as survival mechanisms. They're not choices in the classic sense. They're survival mechanisms that have emerged over the years. We know that long-term exposure to psychosocial adversity alters the dopamine system. In this PET scan, it showed that the striatal dopaminergic function was dampened. Okay, so the excitement's starting to build. The evidence is really clear. Trauma, stressors, and adversity, particularly early in life, but not necessarily, right? They're more likely to become biologically embedded early in life, affect addiction-like pathways. And again, a UCLA group showed that among those that had early life adversity, reward regions in the brain predict processed food consumption. And again, this is not surprising given what we know about food addiction and drug addiction. Other evidence has shown that those that are exposed to multiple ACEs are particularly vulnerable to impulsive self-control, especially when there's negative emotions. A similar concept is delayed discounting. This is the trade-off between things that are smaller and sooner versus larger and later. So a lot of times after adversity, people will be spending their life trying to manage what feels like their crises, right? They're just trying to get out of an immediate crisis, and the crises might actually exist. A lot of times it's perceived. So a lot of times those that are exposed to trauma are registering threats, okay? And when you're registering threats, you're thinking about survival. We're not thinking about what's going to happen 20 years from now. You're thinking about how can I manage living in this day that I'm in and just wanting to get by and get to midnight so I can move on. So there's a lot of crises management, there's a lot of threat vigilance, and there's a lot of unsafety that occurs, okay? And a lot of this comes from changes in the brain, okay? MRI data on adolescents showed that the trauma group becomes less able to relax, right? They're more vulnerable to risky behavior. And a lot of this has to do with changes in the structural, functional, and morphological features of the brain. Sometimes it's the volume of a brain area, and oftentimes it has to do with the connectivity, okay? We have seen in systematic reviews strong relationships between maltreatment and executive functioning deficits. So children that have been exposed are less able to weigh the pros and cons. They're less able to make sound, logical, rational decisions because they're more in the immediate focused crises management mode. There's data on hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that's responsible for memory, being reduced in terms of volume. So PTSD, other forms of childhood neglect and abuse can and often will reduce hippocampal volume over time. There's some evidence that the amygdala can increase in terms of its size. The amygdala is responsible for a lot of emotions, things like craving, depression, anxiety. But in systematic review, the evidence for the hippocampal reduction was stronger than the evidence for the amygdala. But I just want to clarify, it's not just always about volume. It's about how these parts of the brain communicate with other parts of the brain, okay? So for example, the amygdala and frontal cortex, how do they connect with each other, okay? And these are really important concepts that have not been fully unpacked or described yet in the literature. Another area is changes in the white matter and in the gray matter. And then obviously altered neurotransmitter metabolism and production. We talked about dopamine, but I just want to emphasize that there are several others: serotonin, GABA, glutamate, etc. Great paper here, separates early life adversity into threat and to deprivation. So there's forms of adversity that are more about lack and deprivation, whether it be resources or love, and those that are related to threat, and they affect the body differently. They affect the way emotions are processed, they affect the way that the brain works, and this can lead to psychological changes, which essentially lend themselves to altering our lifestyle behaviors, okay? Highly recommend this paper as well. So what does this all mean? Where is this headed, right? All the pathways linking the gut to the brain, I will say, are nutrition related. If you think about barrier permeability, the immune system, the HPA axis, the microbiome, they're all nutrition related. Therefore, one must be able to argue that a dietitian must have an important role somewhere along the treatment trajectory. I believe that eating disorder training needs to get out of the box. I think the training, some of it's a little bit outdated because it lacks emphasis on some of this physiology and biology that I've talked about today. I do believe that the eating disorder treatment world has done a lot of things right, and I'm proud to be a part of it. But I do want to say that there's some major gaps that I think we need to fill. One is that the paradigm has been very well focused on the restrictive eaters, but I don't think it's well equipped to deal with those people with eating disorders that are not from the restrictive background, okay? We know that dieting and restriction is a risk factor for the development of eating disorders, but as a public health professional, one of the questions that I'm starting to pose is, where does all the dieting come from in the first place, right? Why are people dieting? Is it just about diet culture and making money? Or is there higher levels of stress, trauma, and adversity that have changed our relationship to food that might be a risk factor for dieting as well? One of the strong theories in the eating disorder world is called the transdiagnostic theory. It proposed, and this was prior to the binge eating disorder being in the DSM-5, that the eating disorder diagnosis is not relevant and that it doesn't really matter, that they all can be conceptualized similarly, and that people move across diagnoses over time. But I will say that, with this new data on food addiction, there's definitely some new phenotypes. There's some new phenotypes of disordered eating. And this data that I've shared with you does challenge the transdiagnostic theory to some extent. So intuitive eating is a revolution. I'm a big fan. It's something that I use in my practice, and it's something that I've been able to help a lot of people with. Most dietitians know this work has been pioneered by dietitians, it's an incredible tool that we can use. And the assumption is that we can trust our body wisdom. But I'd like to put in some nuance. I'd like to introduce some nuance to this conversation that I haven't heard enough of. If someone's gut is okay, there is an addiction, their hormones are stable, they've been trained in mindfulness, they don't have trauma, you can assume that someone can be in sync with their intuition and trust their body wisdom. But check it out. If someone has a history of trauma, PTSD, early life adversity, they've got leaky gut, there's neuroinflammation, there's addiction, their hormones are all out of whack, and they're mindless in terms of their behaviors, it's not safe to assume that someone's going to be able to intuitively eat. Does that mean that that shouldn't be a goal? No, it just means we have to be realistic. I've seen too many people, trauma survivors, go to see dietitians, and all they do is tell them to do intuitive eating, and they feel like they didn't get them. They feel like they didn't understand their physiology. So I really want to introduce some nuance here, is that there is no single food philosophy that's going to work for all people. We have to think about biology, okay? Calorie is not a calorie. Oftentimes it is about the food. Just talk therapy sometimes isn't enough. We need an intervention. We need a public health intervention in order to reverse some of the challenges that we're up against. Sometimes we don't have evidence-based treatment, so we have to look at treatment-based evidence. We do know that a lot of people, eating less processed foods and more whole foods do feel better, and this is more pronounced in some people than others. We never really knew why. Now we start to know that a lot of the foods that exist in the food supply actually have ingredients that negatively affect the gut, that can increase inflammation, and that can have negative effects on mental health. So I put a lot of emphasis on fiber, as a key anti-inflammatory nutrient. A lot of times people have been on a chronic low fiber diet, so introducing fiber has to happen slowly and gradually over time. Sometimes moving really slow is the way to go. I tell people, let's go one baby carrot at a time. Focusing on improving gut health is definitely a part of the nutrition for mental health conversation. I recommend getting fiber from food, not from supplements. We're talking about using a wide range of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, combining cooked food with raw food, and eating a wide range of these things on a daily basis, getting a fruit or vegetable with every meal or snack. We know that polyphenols are important. It turns out that for gut health, it's not just fiber, there's a synergy between fiber and the polyphenols, which really reinforces the importance of helping people eat real food. These compounds are preferred by gut bacteria and have potent anti-inflammatory effects, as most of you already know. We've got the probiotics, we've got the prebiotics, we've got the postbiotics. There's a lot of pathways by which anti-inflammatory approaches through the gut have potential to affect mental health. Now, I'm not going to say that the evidence is strong and robust, but the experiments are happening. And, from my clinical anecdote, I can tell you that nutrition has a profound effect on mental health, but it's not something that happens slowly. It's something that happens over time. And that's an important thing for people to know when I'm counseling. It's not like we're going to change some of the ways that you eat and then, mental health disorders are going to just go away or change. But slowly over time, things can start to change. And when people are realistic about that, it's such a better predictor of a positive outcome. We know that probiotics in certain studies can reduce depressive symptoms. The evidence around anxiety isn't as strong, but we know that there's a lot of research still needed. Of course, when talking about trauma and mental health, we need to think about eating disorders. We need to screen for, exercise addiction, skipping meals, dieting, lots of emotional charge, leaving the table after eating, laxatives, teas, weight loss supplements, hiding food, playing with food, following diet stuff on social media, orthorexia and obsession with the quality of food. These are all really important conversations in the context of both trauma and food addiction and drug addiction. The big picture goals are, cooking classes, right? Like getting people to develop more life skills, being able to get busy with grocery shopping, meal planning, kitchen cleaning. A lot of people don't like to clean. That's why they don't want to cook. Do you know that? A lot of people don't want to cook because they just don't want to clean. You find that out after you really dive deep with some people. The big picture goals are not weight focused. We're focusing on overall health. We're focusing on body, mind, spirit, behavior change, self-efficacy, sanity restoration, recovery, eventually helping people develop a relationship with food and exercise that is both intuitive as well as personal. And we want to avoid quick fixes wherever possible. Coming back to this diagram, I think it's really important to understand that this is an individual model as well as a public health model, and that in order to really understand food addiction, we have to understand the role of dietary restraint. This book chapter really discussed how misapplied restraint, which means trying too hard to change the way you eat, cutting foods out, can actually worsen people's eating pathology, especially if there's, food addiction. So, in this paper, I discussed these divergent explanatory theories to understand food addiction and eating disorders, and I proposed 3 debates. Debate 1 is, we need food but not drugs to survive, therefore food addiction cannot exist. So I argue against food addiction. Debate 2, food addiction could be as relevant to eating disorders as it is to obesity. And lastly, restriction, not food addiction, causes dysregulated eating, and therefore the notion of food addiction does more harm than good by encouraging restriction. So if you can notice, there's nuance here. It's not just like, oh, this is a thing. This is a thing that we need to think about, and we need to have clinical intuition to be able to help people discern. So in our most recent paper, I describe an eight-step process in helping people figure out if food addiction is real or not. Okay, so after we assess for food addiction, we then assess for dietary restraint. We assess for eating disorders. If someone has a high level of dietary restraint, the dietary restraint might be driving the food addiction. If they don't have dietary restraint, then we go on and look at their substance use disorder history. We can look at drugs, alcohol, caffeine, nicotine. If someone has food addiction based on the YFAST 2.0, they don't have dietary restraint, they do have substance use disorder, and then we look at their trauma history and they have PTSD or PTSD symptoms, and it's stemming from early life adversity, you can make the conclusion that food addiction is a relevant construct, right? In the context of substance use disorder and trauma, there is an alteration in the way that people eat. Does that mean that they need to get super rigid and restrictive? No. But does it mean that that can be helpful to some people? Yes. Do we have the answers on who's the right fit? No. A lot of people think they're a food addict because they just want to lose weight. They just want to diet. They want to go off sugar. And just because someone thinks they're a food addict does not mean they are. And just because a clinician thinks someone is does not mean they are. So we need better discernment in the field. Food addiction treatment does not always require food abstinence. Sometimes behavioral abstinence works better. This is when you might become abstinent from binge eating or night eating or going through drive-thrus, etc. It may warrant reduced exposure. It does require recovery. So this is where someone like me comes in. We're talking about recovery, healing trauma, bringing the body back in, yoga, meditation, breath work. Brains can be rewired. And when we start to think about these things in a recovery context, it can be way different than just a handout or a meal plan, okay? So self-destructive black and white thinking should always be challenged. But again, I said it before, I'll say it again, the composition of the food we eat, it does matter, okay? We need to look beyond nutritional quantity, these calories or exchanges. And in some cases, not all, we have to consider nutritional quality. We talked about the biological embedding of adversity across multiple biological systems. There's several things that I didn't talk about, like the vagus nerve, the autonomic nervous system. There's a lot more. I just barely scratched the surface. This idea of, epigenetics, gene expression, hot topics, and also thinking about it from a social science perspective, the cumulative disadvantage in terms of the social determinants of health. But, it's been stated that the impact of childhood adversity is not always redeemable by subsequent experience. Some people are resilient and some people will struggle based on the biological embedding. Could be a totally separate talk, but I'll just say a couple key points. The timing does matter of adversity. If for example, a sexual abuse happens at age 3, might be different than age 9 or age 15. The type of adversity does matter. The susceptibility factors, whether it be biological or family system, matter. Resilience matters. There's a lot of room for research on positive contextual factors that help people bounce back and become resilient to these exposures. And gender definitely seems to matter. There's differences between internalizing and externalizing psychopathology that are also related to gender and could be an entirely different talk. So to summarize, ACEs can become embedded in multiple ways, which include neurobiological adaptations. It affects behavioral patterns, which affects our mental and physical health. ACEs can be an upstream risk factor, more common and more causal than many other public health issues, and the effects of them can be stable and long-term. Our society does bear responsibility to protect children from adverse childhood experiences. A lot of these exposures are preventable, particularly amidst the addiction crises. And this topic needs more attention in the policy arena. Different ideas for future directions include differences between different types of adversity, the biological signature of PTSD, the role of impaired sleep, right? A lot of trauma affects sleep, and how does sleep act as a mediator in these health outcomes? How to manage impaired reward systems with respect to eating behavior. Is the message of just do moderation always the best message, right? Is that going to always work for people? Is there a room for trauma-informed eating disorder treatment? So this is a key feature of the talk today. This is from a handout that's released last year from the California Department of Public Health. It's called Trauma-Informed Nutrition Therapy, right? Which is the talk today, okay? Trauma-Informed Nutrition. You should be able to Google it and find it. It's a PDF resource that's available online that you should be able to find. So why trauma-informed nutrition? Trauma and adversity of any kind, this is a summary of what we talked about today, can disrupt biology and exacerbate an unhealthy relationship to food, leading to poor nutritional health. The relationship between food, individuals, families, and communities must be treated with compassion and a holistic perspective that acknowledges individual, historical, and systemic trauma. Adverse food-related experiences, so this is widening the definition of ACEs, could include food insecurity, right? Unreliable and or unpredictable meals, restriction and control over food, maybe coming from a family member, body shaming, a loss of food traditions through migration or other cultural changes, manipulation, punishment, reward with food, shame, bias, stigma when utilizing food assistance, untrustworthy or inadequate nutritional supports. And there's a wide range of behaviors that can result from these adversities. Some of these papers I've cited today, things like hoarding food, binge eating, compulsive overeating, high sugar, high fat, high salt diets, reliance on convenience foods, eating disorders or food addiction, or both, decision making to meet short-term rather than long-term goals, and deprioritization of planning and budgeting. So, what can the dietitian do? How do we apply a trauma-informed approach to nutrition programs? Dietitians can acknowledge historical and systemic trauma. So not just thinking about in the household, but certain groups that have a long legacy of trauma, systemic structural issues, racism, etc. We can focus on holistic well-being rather than obesity and BMI. I'm telling you, I don't weigh people. They come into my office, I have a scale, I don't even weigh people. It's very rare that I do, and if I am, it's probably because I'm working with someone that's underweight and we're trying to gain. Refraining from overemphasizing personal behavior change, okay? We want to refrain from overemphasizing personal behavior change. We don't want to put the, this feeling of it's your responsibility and if you can't do it, you're a failure, because that creates shame and that creates stigmatized conditions, and thus the cycle continues. Recognize that some nutrition interventions may be triggering. Give someone a meal plan and they're triggered because their mom put them on some kind of a diet. We need to not give out diets as much. We need to think about guiding principles, philosophies, things that can be helpful to people, not just this is your intervention, this is what you need to do. We need to identify the willingness or ability of clients to adopt new behaviors. We need to acknowledge the strength and skills of clients, inspire healing and a healthy relationship to food. And I'll say this, in my professional experience, getting people to cook when they haven't cooked can be a part of the healing process, can be a spiritual process for some people. Reducing shame, anxiety, confusion, and tension, practicing cultural humility, and addressing our own conscious and or unconscious bias. So people want to know, Dave, what's your food philosophy? They want to know, you're an eating disorder dietitian. Do you have a food philosophy? What is it? Tell me. And I say, I used to build this hybrid model where it's like all foods fit, but not all foods fit for all people. But you know what I say now? I don't have a single food philosophy. I have many skills. I have multiple food philosophies that I use for a wide range of different people. Having a single food philosophy and extending it to every patient or client who comes to you that's easier on you, and it can be harmful to the patient or client. And that's something that you should really start to think about. If all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So us as dietitians, we need to diversify our toolkit, become well-versed in a wide range of things in the physical health domain as well as in the mental health domain. I always try to remind people, don't be a one-trick pony. Think about things on a spectrum, on a continuum. Let's get out of the black and white thinking. Let's get out of the campsite stuff. You're either with us or you're not. You're either diet or you're non-diet. Let's think about how we can look where these ideas converge and where we can put ourselves, lower down on the priority list and put our clients and patients higher. And this is a really, really important message. And I just want to emphasize that stigma is recovery's greatest enemy. We need to reduce stigma, not just around weight, but around addictions and mental health. We see what we see on the surface. We see leaves, we see branches, but there's a lot going on. We call it getting root of the problem. But in public health, we don't just look at the root. In public health, we look at the soil. We look at all the contextual factors that come into play. And this is a really important conversation that we need to have. Thank you guys so much for your attention. please get in contact with me, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Wow. Thank you, David. It's phenomenal. I hope everybody will agree with me. I think I heard you multiple times, but every time I listen to you, it gives me that I'm really listening to you very first time. So thank you so much. And we have many questions. Actually, I would call them as a very well thought, long questions. So I'm not going to waste any time and going to start right away with the first question actually. So we have a question from Meenal. She's asking, can structural changes in the brain caused by ACE be reversed?
Great question. We don't have data there yet. We do know that contextual factors like positive childhood experiences, living in certain enriched environments can create resilience, and that there is room for neuroplasticity, so parts of the brain to change. There is room for epigenetic changes to be reversed. However, I will say that the majority of the data, especially when they looked at like Romanian adoptees, they found that even after they were put into positive environments, that a lot of the changes were persistent over time. So that's the bad news. Yes, there's room for recovery and reversal, but in certain types of ACEs and at certain developmental periods, the impacts are lifelong.
Great. We have another question from Allison. Actually, she's pointing out that during COVID pandemic, there have been so many stressors present. And her question is, how do we as a dietitians ensure we provide optimal care to those must be affected, those most affected and during this terrible time in general?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest challenges with the work that I do in private practice, right? Like I'm in private health, right? And then I study public health, right? So it sometimes feels really unfortunate that, because insurance doesn't cover a lot of our work, that I only end up working with the more advantaged groups. But the question about, the COVID thing is important, right? I work with a lot of mental health professionals, and I know a lot of their practices have really boomed during this time. I think one of the best things that we as dietitians can do is partner with therapists. Like network well with therapists and refer a client to a therapist, and have a therapist refer a client to you, and then work together. I think that there's a lot of that collaboration in the eating disorder space, but I think we as dietitians can do more of that in general.
Thank you. And I think the next one is the comment. Kayleen actually is saying that thank you for pointing out that not everyone can intuitively eat with ease. No single eating approach should be recommended. And yes, I think we all will agree with that. So the next question is Valley. And a great comment that David, your passion is contagious. Your clients are lucky because you are knowledgeable, understand them, and you are sensitive to their needs. As we encounter teen students, resurrection coming out from this pandemic, can you supply a sample of what I can say to a young student that I suspect has an ED? How can I probe with my student but use the right word? So you can answer, then I can read the second part of his question.
Yeah, I've gotten this question a lot, and there isn't like a single formula, right? In other words, working with eating disorders and mental behavioral health does require the development of clinical intuition over time. I can tell you that when I was brand new to the field, I was nervous, right? Like when I was an intern, I worked at UCLA, Ronald Reagan, in the eating disorder unit. Like I was nervous about having conversations, and when you to tell that you're nervous, it creates some energy. So trauma survivors have what I like to call antennas, right? They're able to detect threats. They're able to read people better because it's a survival mechanism. So I think one of the best ways is to like just lean into practicing being around these populations and these groups to where you get more clinical intuition, and so that we're not just using manualized approaches. But to answer your question in a way that I think you're more looking for, sometimes, you know, the best thing is just to ask someone about their relationship with food in their body. How's your relationship with food in your body? Because they go together, and usually when there's an eating disorder, there's some entanglement between those two.
Great. And then he added that, and then what would be next step to facilitate their decision to seek help? It is the best to recommend one line educational resource where the team can maintain um, anonymity. I just don't want to pressure them or stress them, just curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, it's tricky, you know, because sometimes we need to intervene on people. We need to get them into a group or into therapy. And other times, you know, pressing too soon can move people in the opposite uh, direction. Sometimes pressure and stress is helpful. Sometimes it's not. And so it's hard for me to know from an outside perspective when it is and when it isn't.
Totally. And there's another comment from Valerie. You are just the best. I appreciate your brain. I always enjoy hearing about your research. And I
Thank
would
you, Valerie.
completely agree, Valerie, with you. Then another comment from Silva. Your work, your research, and enthusiasm is just amazing. And she's asking one question. I'm passionate about this topic as I work with EDOs and patients who are victims of childhood trauma, relapse for years, and I have seen 20 plus years. In their recovery after completing a residential EDO programs is slim compared to other EDOs patients. Some did not even respond to ECT or CBT. Do you have an interdisciplinary team working with you in your private practice?
So yeah, and I'm in West Los Angeles, and the world of, you know, private sector mental health treatment is extremely robust. So, you know, I've had the privilege of working with a wide range of different therapists and psychiatrists, and there are times when the team approach is the only way. There are also times when resources are limited, and so what I've done with therapists is like, you know, maybe the therapist knows that they need to see me, and they said, let's do 4 sessions with David, and they'll send them to me, and I'll do my 4 or 5 sessions and send them back to them. There are times when I'm ready to discharge someone, but I know they need ongoing care, so I'll discharge them to the therapist. So, you know, to summarize, ideally, someone would have the resources to be able to do dietitian therapy and psychiatry and do all those things. But realistically, sometimes we have to be selective about how much people can do at one time, and, you know, how long we'll be able to work with people.
And next comment from Tony. Tony is saying that my head is spinning in the best way possible. So much to think about in this field, and it's so important. Thank you for the work you do, your passion, enthusiasm, and it's much appreciated. So I think I do not see a such. Let's see. Okay, so there's one actually. Monica is asking, thank you so much, David, for an amazing presentation, packed in current information and practical suggestions for us. So I think there's no question, but would you mind answering, because we have 2 questions were like previously posted on the session QA. Would you allow me to ask those questions too?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let me go ahead and see those. Okay, so there was, I can see the who asked, but the question is, this is such an interesting topic. I often teach mindfulness, and I recently learned that if someone has a history of trauma, mindfulness practices may not be surprised as they could trigger the trauma. Will assessing trauma and the role or the lack of role of mindfulness be addressed in this? And I'm pretty sure we addressed that, correct?
Yes, but it's worth saying that, you know, similarly, you know, meditation, there's some people that really teach meditation. I'm a student and a teacher of meditation. I believe in it, but if someone has a lot of trauma, okay? Their meditation practice might not be accessible. They might have intrusive thoughts, right? So we do need to think about how things like mindfulness, other mind-body approaches. I've worked with people who can't stand yoga. They cannot stand it because they're not comfortable connecting their body and their brain. They're dissociative. And so we need to remember that when there's trauma, some of the interventions that we believe in and that work so well might not actually be the right intervention for that person, or just might not be the right intervention for them at that time. So if we wait for the safety and stabilization to occur, we wait for the recovery to come along further, then some of those strategies like mindfulness or meditation or yoga might actually be way more effective. So I think it's safe to say that timing is very important.
Mhm. And then we got another question. I am usually hesitant to bring up questions about known trauma as I do not feel I am equipped to handle or guide the conversation where it needs to go. With only an intro to psychology class under my belt that I took over 10 years ago, how can I help my patient with trauma as a dietitian?
Thank you. Yeah, it's really important to acknowledge that being trauma informed does not mean that you need to be talking to your clients and patients about their trauma, right? It's really just understanding that these things exist. Okay. And there's going to be times when you don't know if it exists or not. That's when working with a therapist can be helpful. I collect data as a PhD student in my practice. So I screen for ACEs, I screen for PTSD. Those are things that I do as a researcher. But I understand that not everyone's able to do that. That being said, don't confuse trauma informed for trauma discuss, right? Trauma informed can mean that you're very attuned to the possibility that these things exist, and you might not even need to ever go into it with them. If someone feels safe, that's a different story, but we're never taking the lead and asking for specific details, because sometimes the discussion of these things can be very, very difficult, very triggering for people. It's not uncommon that people go to trauma treatment and end up binging because they're now talking about their trauma, and there's a lot of that occurs. And I think the last part of that question is like, where can I learn more? I think that as a dietitian, I've read and attended conferences in mental health for years. I go to the psychology conferences, the marriage and family therapist conferences. I read books on trauma, and those are all things that might feel far-fetched for some dietitians, but it is definitely it's definitely worth your while if you're going to move into the mental health space.
Thank you. And I think they're a great comment, great talk, bravo. This is outstanding. So phenomenal. So absolutely, I say thank you, David, for giving us such a valuable insight, and kudos to your research. And I can't see in future what you can bring. And at this point, I think there's no more questions. So I want to take this opportunity to actually thank you all attendees. Your questions were very thoughtful. So along with your speaker, I want to extend a sincere thank you to each of you to be in this session. Thank you so much for being here. And I take opportunity again to thank you, David, for bringing this talk. It's such an important talk, and we dietitians certainly needs to start thinking in this and utilize this particular area and apply in our practice. So thank you so much for bringing in your expertise and enriching us. So at this time, I think we are ready to close. We want to say to everyone, please enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you so much for being here. So Gigi, if you want to